What if the very thing Islam says never happened is the exact thing that shows Islam cannot be true? Today we are looking at one of the biggest contradictions in religious history. It puts Islam in a situation where there is no good answer. No matter which way you go, Islam loses.
Imagine you are one of the 12 disciples. You just watched your closest friend go up through the roof into heaven. You know the man hanging on that cross is not Jesus, it is somebody else. You saw the whole thing with your own eyes. Now here's the question, what do you do with that information? If you are honest, you tell people the truth. Jesus escaped, he is alive, he was never crucified. That is your testimony. But that is not what the disciples did.
Every single one of them went out and told the world that Jesus died on that cross and came back to life. Peter said it, Paul said it, James said it. They did not just say it once, they said it for the rest of their lives. They were beaten for it, imprisoned for it, killed for it. Nobody dies for something they personally watched not happen. And that right there is the crock in the foundation of one of Islam's most important claims. Let me back up and explain.
The Quran says Jesus was never crucified. According to the Quran, it only looked like a crucifixion to the people watching. Jesus was never actually nailed to a cross. He was taken up to heaven by God and was never killed. Now, most Muslims do not just leave it there. They want to explain what people actually saw that day. So where does that explanation come from?
It comes from a companion of the Prophet Muhammad named Ibn Abbas. He passed down a story that became the most popular Islamic answer to this question. Here's that story. Before Jesus was taken up to heaven, he gathered his disciples and asked which one of them would be willing to die in his place. A young follower volunteered. God made this young man look exactly like Jesus. The soldiers came, they grabbed the lookalike, they crucified him. Jesus went up to heaven.
On the surface, that sounds like it could explain things, but the moment you think about it carefully, the whole story collapses under its own weight. Here's why. In this story, the disciples are right there. They are eyewitnesses. They watched the young man volunteer. They watched him change to look like Jesus. They watched Jesus rise through the roof. They knew the person on the cross was not Jesus.
So these same disciples who personally saw the substitute plan go into action, then spent the next several decades of their lives telling everyone they met that Jesus died on a cross and rose from the dead. That does not make sense, not even a little. You cannot explain it by saying they were confused. They were not confused. According to the Islamic story, they had a front row seat to the whole thing. You cannot explain it by saying they forgot. People do not forget watching their leader rise through a roof into heaven. The only explanation the Islamic story leaves open is that the disciples intentionally lied, that they chose to go out and preach the exact opposite of what they witnessed, and then chose to be tortured and killed rather than simply tell the truth. That is not a realistic explanation. That is a theory with no foundation. Now here is where it gets even more serious. Jesus did not just die on a cross. He said ahead of time that he would. Multiple times, in clear language. He looked at his closest followers and told them he was going to suffer, be killed, and come back to life 3 days later. This is recorded in the earliest accounts we have of his life. One of those moments is especially hard to dismiss. A disciple named Peter heard Jesus say this and immediately tried to talk him out of it. He pulled Jesus aside and said, "No, this is not going to happen to you." Jesus turned to him right in front of the group and said, "Get behind me, Satan."
Now ask yourself this, why would early Christians make that up? Peter is one of the most respected figures in the entire faith. Nobody sits down to write a story about their own hero and invents a scene where Jesus calls him Satan. That is humiliating. That is the kind of uncomfortable, cringeworthy moment that ends up in the record for one reason only, because it happened.
And it matters because of what it means for Islam. Islam teaches that Jesus was a true prophet of God, a genuine messenger. His words were trustworthy, his predictions were real. But Jesus predicted his death and resurrection over and over again. So now Islam is locked into a problem it cannot get out of.
If Jesus was a true prophet, his predictions were true. That means he really did die and really did rise again. But the Quran says that never happened. So the Quran contradicts the prophet it claims to honor. If the Quran is right and Jesus was never crucified, then his predictions were wrong. He told his followers something that never came true. That makes him a false prophet. And Islam cannot have a false prophet at the center of its story. There is no third door. There is no escape hatch. Islam is caught between its own beliefs pulling in two opposite directions at the same time.
Now, let me show you one more thing that points to the crucifixion being a real historical event and not a story that was invented. During the trial that led to Jesus being handed over to the authorities, a group of witnesses stood up and accused him of saying he would tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. That accusation was used against him. People mocked him for it while he was dying. It was a big deal. But here's the strange part.
2 of the gospel writers report that accusation without ever explaining where it came from. They mention it like the reader already knows the backstory, but they never give the backstory.
A third writer does, though, and a completely separate account. That writer records a moment earlier in Jesus' ministry where he was challenged to prove himself and said, "Tear down this temple and I will raise it in 3 days." That writer then explains that Jesus was not talking about a building, he was talking about his own body. One writer sets up the story, a different writer accidentally explains it without knowing the first writer needed the explanation. Neither one is trying to fill in the other's gaps. They're just both recording real things they knew. That is the kind of connection that shows up in eyewitness accounts. It does not show up in carefully crafted fiction, because if you are making the whole thing up, you make sure your own story makes sense on its own. You do not accidentally solve a mystery in a completely separate document. So here is the full picture.
The Quran says Jesus was never crucified, but the people who were closest to Jesus, the same people the Quran considers to be believers and followers of God, preached the crucifixion and resurrection until the day they died. Jesus himself predicted his death repeatedly in accounts that carry every sign of being genuine, and the gospel records connect to each other in ways that only real events can produce.
Islam is not just disagreeing with Christianity on a side issue. It is making a claim that directly contradicts the testimony of the very people it considers to be on God's side. That is not a small problem. That is a crack that runs all the way to the bottom. If this raised a question in your mind, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. If you want more content like this, subscribe. New video coming soon.